And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and we're glad you tuned in. I'd like to remind you of the value of leaving reviews on places like iTunes or wherever you're listening, as well as the value of sharing us with your various networks. It's a real pleasure for me to host most of the TeachThought podcast episodes and get to bring you thoughtful and interesting guests. And as our audience grows, so does the quality and the quantity of guests that are available to us. So we do encourage you and would appreciate any of those reviews, shares, and things like that to help us grow our audience. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to me via email at drew@teachthought.com. If you have stumbled upon us but are not familiar with our work in other areas, just a few notes that we do directly work with schools, leaders, and teachers to help them grow to better prepare learners for what we call the modern world by building upon the ethos of TeachThought.com. So I invite you to visit our professional development website, wegrowteachers.com, where you'll find information on the variety of workshops, consulting services, and events that we offer to help you grow in areas like project-based learning and inquiry, differentiated instruction, assessment, literacy, growth mindset, leadership, and much more. So I invite you again to contact us today to explore how we can help design and deliver professional learning that provokes profound thinking driven by your beautiful questions. My guest for this podcast episode is Michael Hynes, who's the Superintendent of Pat-Med Schools in the Long Island, New York area. You might be familiar with Michael's name because he was a podcast guest in August, and in that episode we talked about his upcoming trip to Finland to visit their schools, and that's what we talked about in this episode. He reflected that this visit to Finland's schools really affected him and changed his educational soul, so I won't go into the details here in what exactly we talked about, but suffice to say that most of it was positive and a few things that maybe he wondered about. So I always enjoy talking with Mike, and I hope you enjoy this conversation and find it helpful and meaningful. As a side note here, I did want to apologize for some technical issues with the sound. You'll notice a few dropouts and maybe some glitchy sound due to our internet connection. I think you'll be able to tell what Mike is saying, and it won't be too much of a distraction, but again, my apologies. Welcome back to the podcast. Michael Hynes, who was on in August August 19th, and so to have you back on so quickly is a pleasure, and we have something in particular to talk about. As we talked about in episode 127, what if we ignored state tests and encouraged more play, and your somewhat controversial or attention-grabbing letter that made the rounds on social media. But you have recently come back from Finland and checking out their education system and schools and that kind of thing. So I'm excited to hear about that experience. I know we mentioned it in the last podcast and said I'd love to have you back on. So here you are. So welcome, Michael. And let's start with kind of the genesis of how that actually came to be before we get into the substance.
Sure. Thank you, Drew, for having me back on. It's a pleasure, and I really enjoyed our conversation. For me, I always feel any great organization, they never get static. They try to learn from the best. They grow, they evolve. They don't believe in staying homeostatic, as I like to say often. And I like to take my teams on field trips to other schools, whether it's a Waldorf school, whether it's a Montessori school, whether it's another public school, let's say, that's trying things that are new and different. I mean, going to Finland totally kicks it up a few notches.
Right.
But I have to say that my Board of Education was extremely supportive of this notion. And then some people may be thinking, well, why Finland? Like, why go all the way over there? Well, the reason is, there's a few. For those of you who care about test scores, international test scores, how 15-year-olds fare around the world, there's the PISA, as most of you may know, the Program for International Student Assessment. And basically, Finland, since the year 2000, has scored initially number one, and they're generally within the top 5, top 6, usually with Singapore and Taiwan and China and Canada now. So from that standpoint, I found that very intriguing. The second thing, after doing a lot of reading and research, is understanding that they do a lot of things the complete opposite of what we do here, which I found very, very interesting. And it's one thing to read something that's usually 1 or 2 dimensional, but I always feel when you experience something and you see it firsthand, that makes it 3-dimensional, sometimes even 4-dimensional. So I went there, Drew, with a friend of mine who happens to be, I want to say an educator per se, but he's a Fulbright scholar, and he's been teaching there several years, sometimes in the summers and sometimes in the spring and fall. And he's actually brought his elementary age son out there, so he got to experience the landscape, so to speak. And he was like my seeing eye dog out there, and he introduced me to anybody that you would want to speak to if you wanted to learn about the Finnish system from the bottom up. And what I mean by that is from the student to the teacher to the parent to all the way where the policymakers are, such as the Director General of the Finnish National Agency for Education. In America, that's like speaking to Betsy DeVos. So I got to see it from multiple perspectives. And as I said to you offline before, Drew, it really changed my educational soul in, I would say, a very positive way.
Well, that's interesting because your educational soul, as it were, was certainly not in a traditional mindset before going. So to see where this is going to end up, or the extent to which it has influenced or affected change in your mindset and thinking, I'm curious to hear. And correct me if I'm wrong, you have at least some kind of relationship or working relationship or something with Pasi Sahlberg, who is associated with Finnish education, right?
That's correct. So I've been fortunate to not only collaborate with him a number of years ago when we had a public forum out here when we were talking about public education. He was one of the panelists, and I'm fortunate enough to speak with him. But over the past year, we've really struck I'd say a pretty good relationship, and he's been following me on Twitter. Certainly I've been stalking him for a number of years. The gentleman, William Doyle, who accompanied me, Pasi and William are finishing a book up, and actually it's coming out this summer. It's called Let the Children Play. And I'm fortunate in our school district here in Patchogue-Medford, we're fortunate enough to be in one of his chapters, actually a chapter in that new book. So, so Pasi and I, before I actually went to Finland, we had breakfast together with William. And he helped network and broker some very interesting interviews and conversations with people. So I've been pretty fortunate.
Yeah, and not to stray too far from what I want to talk about with Finland, but you also recently had Sir Ken Robinson at your district. Is that correct? And what kind of a rock star experience is that?
Yeah, it's funny. If I think of the trifecta of educational icons, that's 2 of them right there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as far as is concerned, and certainly Ken. I can call him Ken now because now I know him. It was a wonderful experience. You know, unfortunately, in November we had a snowstorm, so we were slated to have 900 people attend, and we had roughly around 250, only because we had 6 inches of snow in like 3 hours, and it just unfortunately, people couldn't make it. But let me tell you, having him here, having him speak to our community, and now knowing he's coming back actually in the summer to work with some of our staff and to speak to some of our parents, I'm very, very thankful. And he really has cemented and solidified, I believe, this mindset of what whole child education is, what it should be, and what we can do to move forward together. And that's why this Finnish system ties into not only what he speaks about, but what I believe is in the best interest of all children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I refer to his work and thinking fairly frequently when I'm working with schools and teachers, and often say he puts it so much more eloquently. If for no other reason he has a British accent, but
that's right.
But his words are pretty magical sometimes, and certainly really thought-provoking and powerful. So let's talk about Finland. So when you say it changed your educational soul, and again, it's not like you were some dyed-in-the-wool traditional school administrator prior to this. So what's the biggest shift? What are those big shifts or things that really moved you in this experience?
Yeah, I think what moved me and what surprised me are probably intertwined in some way. What I will say is that well-being is at the center of everything that they do. And when I say well-being, I don't mean high test scores. Mm-hmm. It's truly well-being. So well-being and learning are really intertwined, and they really believe you can't have one without the other, which I found interesting as far as a concept, but then again, to see it in practice really blew me away. So I'll just rattle off a few things that I find not new or different, but really focused on. One is they have a real heavy emphasis on play. I mean, and when I say play, I'm not saying like, playing marbles, or even though they would say that's probably a very high form of learning. But there's a lot of play threaded throughout their educational system. Now, their compulsory education system is really grades 1 through 9. That's really what's mandated, 1 through 9. So that's first and foremost. So their framework as far as education is very different than ours. Their system is extremely efficient in the sense that if you look at their national core curriculum for basic education, and I want to say their latest version is 2016, maybe 2017. It's maybe 300 pages, and it covers everything from grades 1 through 9. And I said this to my staff the other day. If I printed out the ELA standards and math standards in New York State, it would probably fill up my office. So there's a huge distinct difference as far as them drawing a framework from a national standpoint and then trusting teachers to create their own curriculum and assessments that are in alignment with their national basic education. So that's first and foremost. The second is there are no high-stakes standardized testing there, except for their last year. So that means they go through their educational system really not taking high-stakes tests in grades here in 3 through 8. As we know in ELA and math, it's non-existent there. They trust, when I say they, I'm talking about the Finnish government and the National Agency for Education. They trust their teachers like we trust doctors to make decisions. And that's because their teachers there are trained like NASA astronauts. And I got to really spend a lot of time in some of the training facilities there, which are just really second to none as far as I'm concerned. And I'm going over this relatively quickly, but I'm just trying to rattle them off. Here's something interesting. The schools don't compete with each other. So it's not like, school A is competing against school B and against school C, and we're seeing which one's better based on, X, Y, or Z. If you go to a school, and this is the way they want it, in Lapland, which is right, by the Arctic Circle, or you go all the way down south in Finland, let's say by Helsinki, which is extremely cosmopolitan, in essence, you should be walking into the same school. So here on Long Island, if you go 2 school districts down from where I am, it's impoverished, it's, struggling resource-wise. There's a whole bunch of different things, right, that come into place. Their focus on equity and parity throughout, not only the schools, but as a nation, is really interesting. Personal time is highly valued. So not only for students, but for teachers. So it's extremely important that teachers and educators and students take time throughout the day to just be, which I found very interesting because their school day is significantly shorter than ours. Ours, for the most part, is close to 6 hours. Theirs is close to 4, maybe 4.5. All right, so which is again radically different. Teachers teach 20 hours a week there, which I found fascinating. The paradox of less is more, which aligns to the 20-hour teaching day or students being in school for significantly less time. They semi-track students, but not in grades 1 through 9, meaning that there are no AP courses, there are no IB courses, meaning that everybody has the same education in grades and the same experiences in grades 1 through 9. And that's for special education, that's for E&L. There is a heavy emphasis on supporting students who are struggling, whether it's with language. And language there is very important because most students speak 3 by the time they leave 9th grade. And most of them were speaking English better than I do. So the semi-tracking really starts after 9th grade if and when they choose to go to grades 10 through 12th grade. And with that, vocation trades, because there's 2 tracks. You can go to the university high school, that prepares you for university, or you can go to the vocational ones, which have over 300 vocations to choose from, by the way. And they hold both in the same regard, meaning that if you go to college, that's wonderful, university. If you go to vocational, that's wonderful too. And they celebrate both just the same. There is no less than factor for vocational training. And again, their vocational training is state of the art, which I found, again, fascinating. And students chose which direction they wanted to. And there's no dead ends, meaning that if I was a student in 10th grade and after 10th grade, and I was going in the university route and I wanted to change my mind and go the vocational route, I can totally do that. It's not a big deal. And actually, it happens often. So, students choose. It's like a choose your own adventure book, right? When we were younger, and this direction, go to page 157. It's the same sort of notion there. There are no grades until 4th grade, meaning that there are no 1, 2s, 3s, or 4s, or A, B's, C's, or D's, or F's until 4th grade, because their focus is on students understanding who they are as people, understanding learning styles, understanding just love. They want them to love being in school and to self-assess. They want to teach kids to learn how to self-assess. If they know they don't understand something, how to develop those skill sets, which I found really fascinating. And then I would say the last thing is the emphasis on quality of life. Their systems, for the most part, shut down after 4:30, 5 o'clock. Like, if you're a teacher and you leave right after school, you're not going, an administrator's not going, that teacher doesn't care. It's, we want to get home to our family, so we get to spend family time, because that time is really important. And what I found throughout all the schools that I visited, Drew, was that they all had breaks for kids. So at the elementary level, they had 4 15-minute breaks throughout the day, right? Teach 45 minutes, 15-minute break. And I got to see it firsthand. Kids, if they wanted to, they went outside. If they wanted to read a book, they can read a book. To, talk to their friends and do something, totally up to them. The teachers, for the most part, they collaborated. They were taking their time to decide what they wanted to do, to recharge their batteries. And I have several videos that capture this and why they do it, which, again, to me is amazing. At the high school, they do it, they frame it in the way they teach 75 minutes and they have a 15-minute break. Teach 75 minutes, 15-minute break. And what I found throughout all the schools is they have spots for kids, these wonderful opportunities for kids to just be. So couches, lounge chairs, lamps, ping pong tables, pool tables, foosball tables. It's like you're walking into someone's home. It's like an extension of their home. And that's the last thing I think for now I can say is that the environment, not only within the classroom, but outside the classroom, is conducive to feeling like you're not in a hybrid between a prison and a hospital. and that's what our schools look like. There, I felt like we were in someone's home. And that is really what changed my soul in many ways, was the environment and the learning environment, and the way it's structured and the way it looks. And that really, really hit home with me. That's a very long answer. But those are some of the things that kind of, really made me pause and say, what can we bring back here, not only to my school district, but I believe to others?
Well, certainly, maybe it feels like a long answer, but there's so much there to unpack. So the well-being and the sort of holistic approach, I think, is something that is so sorely missed, and something that we try to publish blog pieces around teachers taking care of themselves, but also, really the importance of approaching this not as students being these vessels, or these, even worse, these data points of, name them and claim them, and what are their test scores, and push this forward, that kind of thing. I did a podcast with a gentleman. We talked about metamodern versus modernistic and postmodern, and a metamodern approach to education. And one of the things and resources that he turned me on to, a book that I had read about metamodern, really kind of falls in line with not just education, but just a worldview of how we need to move forward, and really focusing on that well-being. And it feels, I think, to a lot of people counterproductive that, taking time to slow down, to almost be mindful. I'm a big fan of mindfulness, and I from time to time engage in meditation, which can be really hard to do in this world of things really coming at you quickly, partially because we allow them and feel like we have to consume all those things, and that's a dangerous piece as well. It kind of gets to that amount of content and stuff that we feel like people are supposed to know when they come out of our schools or be aware of as citizens, and it feels like it should be that should work, but it's counterproductive. It's causing lots of issues, mental health and emotional issues with our kids and with our teachers. I mean, there's no doubt that teaching is a stressful and difficult job, and that has not been made easier by policymakers. So one of the things that you mentioned that really struck me was the idea of trusting teachers. And there's sort of this dichotomy or balance, I guess, of, we talk about it with PLCs, in the context of PLCs often, of teachers say, boy, I wish we had more time to work and talk and have dialogue and, all of those things. And they're right, they don't have enough. And then administrators say, well, when I give you that time, you don't often use it well, which I think is also true. So how do they, if you know, how do they go about, sort of, is it trust but verify? Is it, what do they do with that extra, assuming that if they're only teaching 20 hours, I'm assuming that they're doing other things with that time that they're not teaching. What does that balance look like, and how do they know that they're doing high quality work?
Great question. So when I spoke with Olli-Pekka Hänninen, who's the Director General, right? So he's the number one person as far as policy and making sure the core curriculum is moved forward. I had the pleasure of speaking to him for about a half hour with his team. And I said, so let's fast forward, finish education 5 years from now. Like, what are the two most important things that you are going to focus on from 30,000 feet? It took about 30 seconds to reflect and think about it. But he knew the whole time. I think it was like a dramatic pause. He then laid this little bomb on me. He goes, we care about two things. First being well-being for all students. And when he said that, I already heard this from parents, from teachers, from university professors. I heard well-being from everybody. Now, unless there's like some massive propaganda movement out there, everyone has to say to Mike when he talks to him, make sure you say well-being. Like, I heard it everywhere, where I was blown away. But the second he said was trust. He said he wants to make sure that the teachers and the educators trust what we are doing as we work together and make this as flat as an organization as possible. And I'm like, wow. Would the New York State Department of Education say that? No. Would the teachers say that they trust the people who are crafting and designing these mandates and policies? Would they trust? No. But there they do. And the reason why they do, Drew, is because of the teachers' training. What it comes down to, it's not, let's do what's inspected instead of expected, right? There really is no inspection because the teachers police themselves. If they find, because they're around each other all the time and they know what's happening in their classrooms, the principal or headmaster there, because they're called headmasters, really aren't there to go into classrooms with a deficit model saying you're not doing X, Y, and Z. The teachers do it to themselves and with each. And that is the power of the training and the high caliber of standard that they not only have for themselves, but what their expectations are for each other. They do it with each other. And I found that remarkable. And again, I would ask this question, how many times you observed? They're like, observed? We're not observed. There's no administrator that comes in. There's nothing called APPR, like a performance review at the end. We're making sure we're doing what we have to do because we're highly trained. That is the reason why the teaching profession in Finland, in my estimation, is held in the same regard as doctors. Because they are extremely professional and they're clinicians with what they do. And I don't know how else to explain it. They don't believe in that model of people coming in and inspecting what they're doing because they do it with each other. And I think, what is it? Deming would say, right? There were, I think he had 12 points as far as, how do you know a system is healthy? One of his points has to do with the workers and the workers really making sure that they're holding each other accountable. And that's what they were doing. And they were doing it in a loving way. It's like, if someone was lagging behind, it's almost like you would have a team of teachers to help support that particular teacher if they were struggling in area A, B, or C. And that was really profound because then I'm thinking, well, what the heck's the headmaster there for? It's like, the teachers are running the schools. And running the schools, I'm saying, clearly they're doing the teaching. The administrators are really doing the administrating.
Imagine that.
Imagine, right? So that was just just blew me away.
So one of the things that we talk about and I really feel is powerful in the work that we try to do with teachers, and I try to emphasize this and have for years with our workshops, especially in our project-based learning workshops, is the protocols and the emphasis on teachers holding one another accountable. And so I'm wondering if you saw evidence of some sort of protocols, and I'm also wondering if, because I think protocols are extremely valuable, but really need to have a great lens through which you're evaluating, so you know that this is what we're looking for. These are the qualitative. This is the qualitative lens through which we're guiding our work and holding each other accountable. And I talk about that with teachers and administrators and say, look, these are things that you should be doing on a regular basis, and have said almost those same things for years, saying, look, if we could go away from, in large part, if not totally, away from these observations and these binders and these checklists and this hierarchical kind of thing, and get more to that idea of administrators being essentially support staff, not the boss, that kind of thing. And teachers, for the most part, are passionate and really want to do great work. And when they're given an opportunity to talk about and give feedback on that work, it's refreshing. And get feedback on their work, it's refreshing. It's not a norm. And we've got some missing pieces as well in sort of the training and some of those pieces. But did you see evidence of really, how do they hold each other accountable, or is it more informal? And what lens do they use to guide their quality?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can say I didn't see or I didn't witness any conversations where they were holding each other accountable. I can tell you where I think it takes place, and I can tell you how often I think it takes place. I think it happens often, and it happens most likely in the teacher's lounge, because the teacher's lounge to them is a sanctuary where it's extremely important for them to go there often and recharge and have these types of conversations across the board. And the teacher lounges are set up where they have massage chairs. They'll have lots of professional books. They'll have different types of seating. And what that environment, lots of plants, very bright, and it allows teachers to have, I believe, those types of conversations in a very constructive way. And if teachers don't go to the lounge during their breaks or during their lunch periods or during certain times, they feel like there's something wrong with the teacher, where, some teachers don't want to go to the lounge because, that's where people, for lack of a better word, right, they bitch and moan, they complain. They're talking about other people. There, it's the complete opposite. It's very constructive. Yeah, they'll probably, voice some concerns they have with X, Y, or Z, but for the most part, they're talking with each other about best practices and how to workshop and work through concerns that teachers have. Now, is there protocol? What are the protocols and what lenses do they look through? That, I have to be honest with you, I don't know what they are. But I have to say, whatever they do have, and we can probably find out what that is, I think works extremely well, because they're open to those types of suggestions from their colleagues. And they're not, at least from what I can see, they're not embarrassed reaching out for help or receiving help. And they didn't look at it as they were being punished per se. So
yeah. Well, I'm wondering.
It's different.
I would be curious to see what. I would imagine they have some sense or some sort of rubric, if you will, that says here are the things that we hold as ideals, and these are the things that we're in pursuit of, and that they use that to guide their comments, their quality control. And to me, that is a real culture thing. And I often say that in our workshops, that if you were to do this regularly, it would be a culture changer. But So many schools, the administrators look at me and say, yep, that sounds great. And then when I check back with them, they've not done it because they're always moving on to the next thing. They don't have time to do those kinds of things, and that's just right. Really unfortunate. I mean, just the idea that you would have time to actually sit and talk with your colleagues in an organic way, I think is a really important piece. I often say, so I taught in several states, the most previous one in Kentucky, and in most Kentucky schools, the lunches, and this is, I think, probably pretty typical in schools around the country, lunches are 25 minutes or something like that. So, teachers are notorious for, number one, being so excited when they can actually, on a professional development day, go out or eat an hour lunch or something like that. But even still, they're scarfing down your food like your condition, because that's what they're used to. And when I taught in California, one of the things I taught in a middle school and a high school, in both of those, in the middle school we had an hour lunch, and in the high school we had an hour lunch, and a little bit different settings and scenarios. But in both of those, the conversations and dialogue I had with my colleagues was tremendously rich and powerful. And sometimes it was, complaining about a kid or an administrator or a parent or whatever. But for the most part, it allowed for that organic conversation that doesn't happen in schools that are always in a rush. And there's a advertisement I took out of a magazine years ago that was an outdoors magazine. It was about climbing, rock climbing, of which I've done almost none. But it said something like, rushing is almost always bad, And I thought, man, that is absolutely spot on. Rushing is almost always bad, and we are in such a rush in our schools. It really is I think, damaging.
It is. I totally agree with you. It is damaging. I can't think of one productive thing that comes out from rushing, aside the fact that you're saying you completed something, but it's not completed well. And that is the problem. We shove 20 pounds of stuff in a 10-pound bag, and with everything that we do in education, and that is probably another cultural thing there, is that the teachers have autonomy to take their time and to delve deeply into something where they're not rushed, whether it's with conversations or topics or lessons or whatever it is. And that's because there is so much trust placed in their lap to do what they have to do. And that's because, again, they're trained so well to I guess, engender that trust. So there's a lot of different edges around this. Clearly, it's hard to articulate in 45 minutes or so, but if anyone who's interested, I had a presentation in my school district about a week and a half ago, and it's on our school website. It's around 75 slides or so. And I think even for someone who didn't hear the presentation, if they saw the slides, they can get a real basic understanding of what it's about. And I think more important, or just as important, what schools can do moving forward. How do you transition some of these ideas, into the places where we are working with kids right now.
And we'll make sure to link to that on our pages. But you mentioned the highly trained teachers and talk about the training. What did you get a sense of what that looks like, and how that is different from what our teachers experience here in the United States?
Oh boy, yeah. Well, first of all, going to school is free. So, and I know when people hear free, nothing's really free. Their system, the way they set things up, for students to go to university, there's no cost, whether it's at the bachelor's, graduate, or the doctoral level. And that means at my advanced age of 48, if I wanted to go for my doctorate again, or for the first time, I can do that for free. And because education is very important. Now, I'm mentioning that aspect because the people who are there, the professors, are all highly trained. And if you're going to university, first of all, if you're a teacher, you are also a researcher. So you're trained in research, not only how to read it and understand it, but to also create it. So you're a researcher and a practitioner. So that's one edge. The second, I believe, has to do with the well-rounded naturedness of the training itself. They have lab schools everywhere, meaning where there are universities where you're trained as a teacher, you have real schools that are attached to it with real kids, and you are working in those settings, and you're working with professors and master teachers, and it's like a hospital model, like a doctor when they're doing their rounds and when they are, going in their last year of residency. It's very highly competitive to get into those particular programs, and once you're in it, you go into the schools, and the student teachers have their own office within the buildings to collaborate and to work on different things. So it's not the amount of time, it's the way they spend their time with the teachers. And this is the last thing. So all teachers have to take classes in multiple areas, where it doesn't matter if you're going to be a calc teacher or math teacher, a science teacher or an elementary teacher. You're learning how to weld. You are learning how to do woodworking. You are learning about how to be an environmentalist, but at a very deep level. Like, you come out of these teacher programs being very well-rounded, like you're very, how to make puppets. Like, I sat in a few lessons where some teachers, and again, it didn't matter what level they were at, had to learn how to not only create puppets, and I mean like real puppets, like or stuffed animals that you would see, because there's a lot of that play aspect, again, of not only designing a puppet, but then making it and then actually showing why you made it, the rationale behind it, the research behind it, and then using it in a lesson is amazing. And these teachers, when they're working with woodworking or metals or tiles or anything else, it's advanced stuff. Music, art, they have to learn how to play an instrument, how to be proficient in it. So they are extremely well-rounded when they come out. And I found that fascinating. And I got to see it again. I got to see it firsthand, which was really... I will never forget that as long as I live. I really felt like these teachers, when they come out, they're better people because they've been exposed to so much. It's almost impossible not to be a better person when you're exposed to all those different things.
That well-being piece and the emotional well-being is really important. I don't know if you're familiar with Dia Han. A couple of her documentaries that I've watched recently on white. One's called White Right, and another one is on jihad. And she really goes in and takes a look at and interviews and talks with these extremists on the white nationalists and then Islamic jihad kind of thing. And both of those, the message that comes through loud and clear is these folks who are susceptible to this extremism are emotionally unhealthy. And they, the ones who have come to realize that have moved away from that. And while certainly that is hopefully not a wide range of our students, there's no doubt the emotional health of our students is something that is really overlooked in our schools and really in our society. But speaking of things that are being missed, so we've talked about all the wonderful things in Finland. I think it's important to ask and think about what are the students in Finland perhaps missing, or what did you see that wasn't as, let's say, impressive, or maybe was on the other side of the ledger that caught your attention?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in some ways. As important as space is and the construction of a classroom, I saw a lot of very innovative classrooms where many different seating arrangements, walls knocked down where 3 teachers were collaborating with each other at the same time with 3 different classes, and that's the way they run, their day every day in 5th grade. So multi-sensory just designs. There were a lot of very traditional, as we would think of back here in the States. Some rows, some desks, some old desks, and chalkboards or whiteboards. So there was a smattering of that. I was surprised. I think I walked in. I went to Finland thinking, all schools, all classrooms are innovative in the way they're designed, and they're not. But there are lots of schools that are being built right now that have that open floor concept. But in some ways, it's still somewhat traditional, especially at the high school. I will say, so sports is another thing, as much as we revere and we highly regard high school sports, or say middle school sports, or for those of us who have very strong football programs, because that's like another religion in some states and, in some schools, it's non-existent there as far as sports for kids after school as part of their high school or middle school, which is, again, a reason why their school day can be shorter in some ways. They have clubs for kids, but when you think of high school sports or clubs and activities such as that, it does, I believe, allow students to have a lot more pride and school spirit in the identity of their schools. There, I didn't find that nearly as much. Like I go to this high school and I'm very proud. This is our, we are the Bears, or we're the Bullfrogs. You didn't see any of that there. So I found that very interesting. And I would say, the parental involvement, and maybe because I was only there, in the classes between 70 and 75 hours, I really didn't see, the parental engagement per se. And maybe that's because the parents really trust the educators. But, like PTAs would invite parents in all the time to do some reading or to be part of, certain things that take place. I didn't notice that as much, which I found very interesting. So those are some of the things that I can't say are bad. It's just that wasn't part of their culture or part of their wheelhouse. I also, just like you, Drew, I believe in mindfulness and yoga and meditation and, those types of things. When I mentioned that for our schools, as far as what we do, that wasn't part of their conversation as far as, embedding that in their either their curriculum or what they do throughout the day. So, those are the things I found a little interesting. But again, the grass isn't always greener somewhere else. Sometimes it's just different shades of green. But I would say on whole, it was better in a lot of ways. And I think there are some ways they can learn from what we do here. Technology, there was a lot of augmented technology, a lot of, I would say they really, it's a pretty tech heavy society in the sense you have a lot of innovators out there, Nokia's out there. So, they're really into working with three-dimensional, different types of spaces, opportunities for kids. And I believe they were really leaning toward a lot of devices, one-on-one devices for kids and screen time. And I think they're starting to retract from that a little bit. So there was a lot of technology per se, but I think they're starting to understand that, too much is not healthy. So, I found that pretty interesting. But other than that, it's hard to, over 8 days to say this is the way it is everywhere. I'm just telling you some of the takeaways that I had, at least initially.
And I think it's really important to understand. I think people certainly know that Finland is different in some substantial ways with demographics and government and those kinds of things. So it's important to note that and say, what are some of the things that we might take away and use here, and perhaps maybe some of those things don't always work here, but certainly asking questions about how we do things, and that sounds like a great opportunity to get to those questions. So one last question here before I let you go. When one of the podcasts I did recently was with a pretty traditional headmistress of a school in London, and we talked about the role of knowledge and the importance of knowledge, and what she said in her work, in her understanding, was that she feels like in progressive education, I would cast us both as progressive educators, that knowledge has been sort of overlooked for skills and soft skills and that kind of thing. And I push back and say I think that knowledge, matter of fact, I've published a blog recently that really talks about the role of knowledge and the importance of knowledge. But did you get any sense of the importance of knowledge, or a balance of knowledge and versus skills in Finland?
It's interesting. So I'm going to go back to the National Core Curriculum for Basic Education. I'm going to read the first sentence. This is the first sentence, okay, in which I think kind of answers that question. The purpose of the steering of basic education is to ensure the equality and high quality of education and to create favorable conditions for the pupil's growth, development, and learning. Now, the reason why I mention that is because what gets them up in the morning is creating those conditions. And I think part of the conditions, once the students are there, or as they say, the pupil, when they are there, is a balance of knowledge and the overall experience as to how students acquire that knowledge. That's probably the best way I can encapsulate that, because I think, knowledge is important, but I don't think that's what gets them up in the morning.
Interesting. I think it's again, it's a misnomer, or if educators are not incorporating knowledge in their work and their learning, then they're missing the boat. But it's I think the difference in the approach that I was talking about in a more traditional is that the knowledge is pulled from students thinking as questions and in a context. So let's contextualize why that knowledge is important and work towards that. So, for example, history, U.S. history, the knowledge is important to help us be better citizens. So let's work on being better citizens. And then that knowledge becomes really vital, as opposed to just pushing that knowledge out and saying this will help you be a better citizen, and by the way, it's going to be on the test and all those kinds of things. So yeah, so interesting. Well, I'm envious. I'm jealous. You got to go see. I'm always interested to see schools, and certainly would love to go see Finland. I'd love to hang out with the rock stars that you're hanging out with, and perhaps one day I'll be lucky enough. But appreciate your time. Where can people find you and all that good stuff again?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook, and if you go to the Patchogue Medford School District website, we have a lot of resources and a lot of information there regarding some of the things. What Doyle and I just published a piece in the Hetchinger report about our trip and what we recommend as a 12-step action plan as far as how to improve America's schools, and we base that on what we experienced in Finland, and some of it has to do with your last question, actually, Drew, which is very interesting. And I think it's a good conversational starter. It's a good starting point for people to start saying, what can we do differently within our classes or within our schools. And I will say this, Drew, Ken Robinson's coming out probably, most likely, this summer to my school district. So if that's the case, you have an open invite. He's going to spend a day here with us. So if that's the case and you're free, you are more than welcome to come.
That sounds like a great time. Let me check my calendar. We'll have to figure out what that date is, and maybe I can come get a selfie like everybody else.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right. Well, his name is Michael Hynes. He's the superintendent of Pat-Med Schools, which is pronounced something that I cannot pronounce, but it's out there in Long Island, right? Long Island, New York.
That's correct.
Right, which is why you talk kind of funny. But Mike, appreciate the time, and it's always a pleasure to talk.
Thanks, Drew. I appreciate it.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.